Number one. So, my parents don't really travel often. Yes, my dad may have been a musician, but I can truly say that the only time he's traveled for work was about a year ago this day. You see, my dad and all his other band members got what cinema would call an offer they couldn't refuse. This offer was to perform on some themed cruise headed for Costa Maya and Cozumel, that of which would pay about 1,000 each in their pockets. With that kind of payment, my dad truly couldn't refuse. Unfortunately, the time of the cruise had coincided with a Thursday, a school day on the 2nd of April. My mom even had a trial to play defense for on that day. So, to our great disappointment, what followed that day of my father splitting for a paid vacation was a week consisting of photos sent by text message that made both me and my mother of quite envious nature. I mean, he got to sip on tequila, play music at poolside while I fought to survive my senior year, and my mother for her client's innocence. However, there were some photos that brought a smile of hilarity to our faces, such as a lonely chicken that my father found just wandering the streets of Cozumel. So, to put it bluntly, our envy became that of jokes upon his returning the following Friday. Almost as soon as he had walked through the door, my dad was spinning stories worthy of being put into a written biography. He told of how the massive Aztec structures we'd been shown had played host to the likes of human sacrifice and bloodletting in ages past, then followed by stating how the two cities played host to their own playing of music by lesser known on street corners after dark. Isn't it somewhat funny how my dad could go from unsettling to jocular in but a blink of an eye? I found so much hilarity in it, as I shared the same personality. I had always had a keen interest in the supernatural, especially when it comes to the subject in which my father discussed. Despite my Christian beliefs, the idea of such entities of myth invoking such taboo and violent behavior has never ceased to astonish me. I just have so many questions as to why one could fear their own theories about the existence, so much that they would so unwillingly tear the heart from their own brother to appease such phobias. I just don't understand why they felt the need to do it. I assume it was for the same reason my dad brought back the skull. It was just before dinner when my dad called me in the kitchen for me to obtain it. When I entered, he was holding it up in somewhat of a Shakespearean style, examining it for any scratch or bump that it may have received on its long journey home. He handed it to me and told me its brief backstory. How do you like it? Found it sitting on the table in one of those old temples. Thought you might be interested. I didn't answer. I didn't want to give my honest opinion, as truth behold, despite my interest in such weird and disturbing objects, I found the thing to be quite unsettling. Let me make it clear that it was not real, but it was actually made of ceramic. It was a work of art carefully crafted by an unknown sculptor of ages past. I could make out the hieroglyphs of starfish and leaves, as well as many other inconceivable shapes. But the unnatural roundness and images of apparent beauty were not enough to hide the uncanny nature of its face. Its eyes were both bored in a deep shade of black, and the color streamed far down the side of its face in four long lines of tears on either side. Its mouth was quite pale, but consisted of these non decaying human lips, the smiles that these lips gave off. A wide, black lined grin. I could feel the stiffening of hairs along my back as I begrudgingly took the thing up to my room after dinner. I set it on the shelf that sat just above my desk and set the thing down on its very end. I decided to go to bed early, so I locked my door, got dressed, and climbed into bed. Just as I was about to shut the light, though, I climbed back out. I approached the shelf and then proceeded to turn the skull to face the wall. Better, I whispered. I wouldn't let that stare gaze upon me as I slept. The next morning, I awoke to much in the way of discomfort. Do you know that pain in your head, that of which a bad night's sleep Joe generously provides? Well, I could feel it, and I could feel it hard. It was almost at migraine level. Thankfully, I could slowly begin to smell the very best thing that one could awake to on a Saturday morning. I made my way to the stairs, ready for so good of a breakfast, and noticed the skull's glare out of the corner of my eye as I left the room. When the near migraine ceased, the day went on as normal. I had breakfast, watched YouTube on my phone for a good hour, played a video game in my room for well into the night. Yes, you may be able to tell from my routine, I'm not a very social person. I would even go far as to say I'm friendless, or even a goth with creepy things that I find interest in. It was about 10 after 11 when I finally decided to shut off the light for some well needed comfortable sleep. I locked my door and climbed into bed, but just laid there in silence. I was uncomfortable, suspicious even. I climbed out of bed once more and walked over to the skull on my shelf, which now appeared as even more awful in the dark. The designs almost appeared as one deep shaded color, and its shape seemed slightly off base in the shadows. The only apparent good thing was the fact that I could not make out the wide, black line smile. I got a burning sense of deja vu as I proceeded to turn the skull around and climb back into bed for a good night's rest. But I didn't rest comfortably. Walking down the stairs with the same apparent headache from the previous morning was only the least of my worries on this particular Sunday. I walked groggily into the kitchen, and as I poured out some cereal, I could feel eyes at my back. I turned my head to see my parents' stares from the kitchen table, both of which were formed into mild glares of disapproval. What? I asked them while yawning. What's the problem? My dad let out a brief sigh as he responded to me. We know you were up late last night. I was confused. What do you mean, Dad? You always let me stay up till 11. Why is it suddenly a problem? Okay, now don't lie. You were up until 3. We could see it. See it? You're late, my mom responded. We could see it from underneath your door. Are we right? I was bewildered, speechless at what they inquired. I know very well from memory that my phone said 11 before passing out yesterday evening. Yep, it was on until at least 3 or a bit later, give or take, my dad continued. Either way, why were you even up that late to begin with? I still failed to supply them with a response. The headache now long faded, but even then I could not think clearly enough to produce words. I. My parents just rolled their eyes and seemed to smile a bit. Look, it's no reason to be nervous, my dad informed. You're at the age you just need more sleep, alright? At least 8 hours is enough, not 4. Still no words. Look, we're just gonna get ready for church, my mom said as they both left the room. We love you, son, but don't tire yourself out. I heard them both stomp up the stairs as I just sat there alone with my thoughts, that of which now were scrambling and unfocused. It was when their door finally shut that I snapped back into normal focus and happened to notice their phones left sitting on the kitchen table. I checked the clocks on both, which shared the exact same time, 8:30. Then I checked my phone, 8:30. My state of bewilderment had now been worsened. I scarfed down my breakfast, and as I finished, I then heard my mom and dad come strolling down, both now fully prepared for church. They were whispering, bickering to each other about what was quite obvious. I then rushed up the stairs to get dressed as well, but checked my parents' room before doing so. Their alarm clock on either side of the bed was also sharing the same times, 8:40. I checked my phone again, 8:40. I slowly backed up, almost unhinged, into my own room across the hall. Upon entering, I noticed it, the skull. It was facing my bed once more, still smiling that same smile. At first sight of it, I had assumed it was my parents who may have laid their hands on it. Then we locked eyes. Its eyes. There was something presiding from deep within them. I was too much in panic to fall asleep that night. I was even too horror struck to enter my own room, as I had assumed it was now cursed by the demonic corpse's head. Now, at this point, I would assume you'd be asking questions somewhere along the lines of why don't you just dispose of the skull? Well, I'd rather ask you of this. If you're almost certain that one of your belongings was haunted and knew what I did about spirits and demons from religion, then would you even have the slightest bit of courage to lay another hand on it? At this point, I was hoping at best to convince my parents to let me sleep on the couch that evening. It took some effort, but they reluctantly submitted to it. This could not have been more of a blessing to me, as things became much more sinister once I went to brush my teeth in the upstairs bathroom. As I stared into the mirror, I could make something out from the reflection of the hall outside the open door. It was unclear at first, but I could now make out, from under the crack of my bedroom door, a glow. It almost seemed to resemble my own lamp when switched on. But then I saw it pulse. It continued to do so in patterns, and I was already halfway down the stairs before it could continue. My parents were already in their respective spots in bed, but did not fail to supply me with both a blanket and a pillow. I set both items on a large sofa and turned off the lamp at the end table. I threw the blanket over myself and laid there. That was it. I just laid there. Even with the distance I had put between myself and it, did I not have even the slightest morsel of courage to shut my eyes. I fought my fears, however. They got progressively heavier and heavier with each passing minute. About 10 minutes in, my head fell to the side. I shot my eyes back open in the following second. Had it been a second? I thought to myself. I went to reach for my phone sitting on the coffee table, but I instead was hit with the harsh reality. My arm wouldn't move. My legs wouldn't budge either, nor my head. I was overcome with terror as I now realized that my body was experiencing sleep paralysis. The only sign of fright I could muster was the mad darting of my eyes as they searched the room for the overwhelming anticipation. I knew what horror was to follow, but was not truly prepared for it at the least. My eyes panned the room in desperate search of any sort of black spot or shadow or other discoloration within the room, or even in the hallway that opened up next to the entertainment center. In my half awoken state, I struggled to see anything clearly. It was just a blur. It took me about a minute or so, but I noticed something. Atop the entertainment center sat a discoloration, a smidgen of white. I could not make out any other features, but that was only due to the blur of my vision. However, my attention to this object was broken as my ears then picked up something else, a whisper. It came from my right. I threw my sight in that direction and happened upon yet another object, a shadow, a humanoid shadow. It was standing out in the hall, staring directly at me. Was it an intruder? That was my first thought. I had assumed it might have been, as they appeared to be wearing a mask. All that was visible of their face was the deep shades of red, whilst the rest of the figure was completely shrouded in blackness of the night. It was motionless, not stirring even an inch. From it had obviously emanated the whisper, which I could still faintly hear. It sounded as if it whispered a single phrase, but I could not tell. It just stared blankly in my direction, and I stared directly back. This went on for what seemed like more than 10 minutes, and all while I felt as though my heart might stop from how fast it was beating now. The dark figure still maintained its glare on me as I could feel my muscles begin to slightly twitch. My legs sparked to life and began kicking sporadically. My arms were able to throw the blanket from my body. Then I blinked. Nothing. Both objects of black and white had now dissipated. My heart began to slow back to its normal pace as a wave of relaxation washed over me. It truly was just a hallucination. I wiped the sweat from my head with the back of my now mobile arm. Even with how calm I now felt, my mouth was so dry and my body was so drenched. I would probably need a shower in the morning, but all I needed now was a glass of water. I turned my whole body to get ready to stand up and head for the kitchen. Suddenly, I felt a tremendous amount of pressure, as though I was being held down. My body pressed hard into the sofa as I stared in horror up at the ceiling. It was right above me now. I could make it out more clearly now, and it was enough to understand what monstrous being I now beheld. What I had once believed to be the shadows was actually a long, black hooded cloak. It ran all the way down to the very bottom of the entity, where it then split off into multiple torn strands. But without these strands, there appeared to be no true bottom to the entity at all. It was all spectral, having no true physical form. Nevertheless, this did not distract me from my recognition of the dark figure's most blood curdling feature, its mask like face. Not a mask, but its true face. The face certainly was one deep shade of red, but the same could not be said for its other features. The eyes in this thing were massive and black as the darkest recesses of space, almost appearing as though completely empty. In spite of their lifelessness, though these eyes appeared to be weeping, the tears had color to them as well, the color of dripping ink. They ran in streams that dripped down the monster's cheek onto its cloak, becoming one with this very color. The emotion this thing inhibited, the expression that it wore, a large, wide, black lined grin. What I had once feared happening before had now finally come to pass. My heart exhausted itself. My chest became immobile as my lungs struggled desperately to take in a breath. It almost felt as though this thing was somehow crushing every organ in my body, prohibiting me from even taking a breath or even speaking. I tried to scream, but not even a choke could escape me. That horrific smile, it was a smile of joy, joy at the sight of my suffering. Do, the whisper. It had returned. I could make it out more clearly. It. It seemed to pass through my mind rather than through its lips into my ears. Do it. The images followed. Those images. Do it. My parent. Do it. In bed. Do it. The blood. Do it. I stood over. Do it. The knife in my left hand. Two red objects to my right. My smile. My eyes. Black. The whispering growing louder. Do it. I was fading, and fading fast. Soon I would be in prison, condemned, free for the taking by this ferocious incubus. But there was no person, no other entity here to fend off this living nightmare. It was pure evil. Our Father, I strained out, who art in heaven, hallowed be. The whisper started fading. The expression, it was now a grimace, as I continued the Lord's Prayer. The pressure was fading and fading fast. In but the briefest of seconds did the nightmare become one with my memory. It had now vanished again into the metaphysical, but what had brought it into this realm in the first place was far from known to me. And then I sat up. The smidgen of white, the glow, it sat upon the coffee table now. I switched on the lamp behind me to better understand what was really looking at me. Once the lamp began flooding light into the room, the glow then dimmed. The skull. No, not the same one. This one was real. The proportions, the texture, the color, it was all real. There was blood on this decrepit thing, large stains of it that covered the entire cranium and jawline. The jaw was sitting wide open, almost appearing as it was screaming in terror. If I had known any better, I'd say it was one part of multiple remains of murder victims, an unwilling participant of human sacrifice. It was changing now. The bloodstains on it were cracking and shrinking. They then rose off and dissipated into the surrounding air, revealing starfish and other incomprehensible shapes. The paleness of the base of its eyes were darkening now, and so were the teeth as the jaw continued to cement shut. That decayed jaw began to grow back into its lips, as well as those very same lips began to curl into that horrible smile, that grin. I got up well before my parents that morning. Hold on, let me reword that. I mean to say that I never even got up at all. I mean, how could I wake up if I never fell back asleep again? I couldn't risk it with that insidious force might be attempting another shot at me, could I? I made sure to let my parents know that I'd been leaving early for school, claimed to them that I would be studying with some friends. Them being half asleep was the only possible way they could have believed such a ridiculous lie. Even them, with what arrogance they had, would know better than to think of me as one of having friends. When I stepped out onto the front mat, I could feel a chill sweep through the morning air. The low temperature persisted as I walked, an unusual level of coolness for this time of the year. It got progressively worse the farther I had hiked, and it reached its very peak upon eventually reaching my destination. Many a shiver climbed up my back as I stared silently upon the mist clad waters of the Long Island Sound. Knowing quite well that I could not hesitate any longer, I slipped on the pair of winter gloves I had packed with me, and then began to unzip the rest of my backpack. I slowly cut my hands around the content of the bag, taking my time as I slowly began to raise it out with as much caution as humanly possible. I hesitated only for about a dozen seconds, then finished the job at last. The skull flew about 100 or so feet forward in one direction before dropping vertically downward. It vanished into the fog that draped over the entirety of the coastal rocks below, and all I could do was listen. Ding, 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 splash. No smash sat anywhere in between it. Not surprising, but still, to my dismay, I could feel the air grow much warmer as the echo of the splash began to thin out. That was just a year ago this morning. No trace was left of his presence in my life, but that doesn't satisfy me in the least. As I typed this up in my college dorm, all I can think of now is the world around me. Where in the world may it have gone? The only true bit of hope I can hold on to is that it may have just returned to its ruin, undisturbed as it relishes in the remains of the first successful Holocaust. It kills me even more to know what little I can do to stop it. Not even my parents may understand it, as they aren't even aware of its absence at this point. That's the cost of being friendless and a goth. My facts do not matter to anyone, as no person would so willingly defend them, no individual in existence to guarantee my saving grace. This just makes it all more painful to bear this new fact, a fact that was once burning question. Our ancient ancestors were not theorists, they were not prisoners, hopeless, despairing. They had to do it. Number two, I grew up in a small town in Guanajuato, Mexico with my aunts and grandmother. My parents were in the US trying to buy a house for me to move into. I was about 5 years old at this time. One calm evening, my aunt and I were going to go down to the town square and hang out with her friends. She instructed me to go tell my grandma that we were leaving. She told me that my grandmother was in the garden. The backyard was big and the garden was at the very back, but I didn't think twice about it. I went to the back of the house and started walking towards the garden. The sun was setting and it was bright enough to see everything clearly. While walking, I happened to glance to my right at an old shed we had. Next to the shed, there was a stack of ceramic roof shingles because the house was going to have a new roof refurbished. What I saw next still gives me chills today. As I looked over to the shingles, I saw a woman dressed in all black. The woman's clothes were the darkest black I'd ever seen. Next to this woman was an all black cat with bright yellow eyes looking right at me. I stopped walking and looked at the woman. I tried to look at her face, but was not able to due to a hood that covered it. The only thing I could tell was that she was not sitting on the pile of shingles, but she was crouching on it. The shape of her knees could be seen through the clothing. Her pale, bony hands dangled down by her feet. I was frozen in place for some reason, but I wasn't afraid. After a few seconds of looking at her, I remembered that I had to go tell my grandmother. I continued to walk to the garden and periodically looked back. I saw my grandmother and told her that my aunt and I were going down to the town square. She acknowledged me as I jogged back to my aunt, and on the way back I looked at the pile of shingles, thinking I would see the lady again. Nothing. Both the woman and cat were gone. I'm 25 years old now, and I still can't explain what the thing on the pile of shingles was. I told one of my aunts that still lives in that house in Mexico about my experience, and she told me that many people have seen that lady and her cat around the town. Everyone seems to agree that she is some kind of bruja or a possessed woman. I recently went back to Mexico to visit my family. Every time I walked past that old shed, I felt like someone was watching me. I don't know if I want to go back there ever again. This is not the only story I have from my childhood in Mexico. Let me know more if I should share. Number 3. The following is a real encounter that I had in May of 2016. I decided to take a cruise vacation to Mexico with my girlfriend. I had just gotten back from a military deployment and was excited to begin a tropical vacation. The cruise ship would make 3 stops in Mexico, departing from California. The majority of the cruise was nice and relaxing, but the following event that took place has haunted me to this day and reminds me of the importance of situational awareness. On the second stop in Mexico, I woke up early and got ready to explore the Mexican coast with my girlfriend. I grabbed some cruise ship breakfast, which was amazing, I'll add, and headed back to the room. She told me that she wasn't feeling too well, probably from the late night before, and was going to get some more rest. I decided to debark the ship by myself and explore what I could. I left the ship and got with another group of tourists that arrived at the dock, where taxicabs and shuttles are lined up already. I decided that I would stick with one of the larger groups for safety reasons. I befriended one of them, and they offered to keep me company, seeing as I was by myself. However, as we all approached a taxi shuttle, it was quickly filled up by the group and I was left by myself again. The shuttle drivers said it was full and to look for a cab and they drove off. I was originally going to wait for another group to leave the cruise ship and tag along with them, but after 10 minutes I grew impatient. A local taxi cab driver walked up to me and offered me a ride. With broken English, he said he could take me to the local restaurants for cheap. I bargained with him on the price and accepted his offer. This was my first mistake. As I followed him to his vehicle, he immediately got on the radio and started talking to someone in Spanish. and I assumed this was his taxi company. I got in his cab and he asked me which restaurant I wanted to go to. I told him to take me to his favorite local restaurant with the best food and beer. He mentioned it would be a little more money than we discussed earlier since it was further in town and away from the beach area. I agreed and we left. I noticed we were driving for quite some time, around 30 minutes, and I could no longer see the ship in the distance, and the local touristy atmosphere quickly changed. The local buildings were riddled with graffiti, and the whole area seemed impoverished. I wasn't bothered by this, as I had frequented Mexico quite often. We finally arrived, and the taxicab driver told me that he would be nearby and that the restaurant bartender would call him when I was done. The restaurant seemed pretty worn down. I'm sure I stuck out like a sore thumb, too, but at this point I was hungry and in the mood for a cold beer. As I walked up to the bar, I asked for the menu. I immediately noticed the bartender didn't speak English, based on the confused look on his face and his response in Spanish. Now, I'm not fluent in Spanish, but I know enough to get by, so I ordered some food with the best Spanish I could conjure up. Thank God for high school. He nodded his head and told me it would be 15 US dollars for the meal and 3 for each beer. 5 or 6 beers and an hour later, I decided to head back to the ship. I noticed I was a little tipsy and probably drank a little too much. I told the bartender I was ready to leave, and he gave me a piece of paper with $60 written on it. I told him it was way more than what he had told me earlier, but he became immediately hostile with me and repeated himself over and over. I looked over to one of the other restaurant employees who just stared at me, offering no help to this situation. I knew I had no power in this situation and just gave him the $60. I walked outside and waited for my cab, pretty annoyed about the recent interaction. I told him to take me to the ship when he arrived. On the way back, I noticed he started taking some unusual side roads. On the way to the bar, he primarily took main busy roads with a view of the ocean and hills, but this time we were surrounded by old, tall, worn out buildings. I asked him where we were going and why we're taking a different route back. He said there was traffic and this was a faster route. At this point, I didn't know what to do. It became clear we weren't heading back to the ship. In fact, we were heading in the opposite direction now. He was driving on inclining roads away from the coast into the eastern regions of the town. My heart immediately started racing. I knew that the further we drove away from the ship, the harder it would be to get back. We stopped at an intersection, and I immediately jumped out, leaving behind a few $20 bills, more than what we had agreed on. He asked me where I was going, and I didn't reply. He parked his cab and started hastily walking towards me while getting on one of his radios. I quickened my pace and started to run, turning down random alleys and walking into a local cell phone store. I walked towards the back and walked into the bathroom, locking myself in. I was pretty sure I had lost him. I was probably in there for a good 15 minutes. I pulled up my GPS on my phone and called the cruise ship company. I didn't exactly explain the situation that I was in, just that I needed a cab, thinking I might have been overreacting a bit. The cruise ship sponsored shuttles came by and picked me up. On the way back, I told the driver what had happened. He looked at me and smirked. He said that I was lucky and the cab driver didn't have good plans for me. He proceeded to tell me that most likely he thought I was drunk and was most likely going to take me to the bad part of town where they would mug me or worse. He also said they were likely working for a local gang. Now, I'm not sure how true that is, but I know for a fact that I was being driven in the opposite direction of the ship. When I got back to the ship, I reported the incident to a crew member, and they shrugged it off and said they'd look into it. I'll admit I made some pretty dumb decisions that day, and I'm lucky to be writing this, so pay attention to your surroundings.